Morning, YouTube. Today we're gonna talk about the first bank and maybe even the second bank of the United States. Why do we need money in this country, and why did the first bank collapse, and then why did the second bank collapse? Now I'm walking over to it now. Here's the first bank of the United States. This was founded by Hamilton to solve a big problem. So we're on 3rd Street in Philadelphia. You can see the big eagle up there. That's pretty cool. Yeah, it's under construction right now because the city of Philadelphia figured out that this building matters a lot. Hey, what's up? So there you go. There's the first bank. It's hopefully gonna look a lot better in about a year. Now what we're gonna do is, it's pretty loud because it's a construction site, so I'm gonna walk around the back here. And while we talk about the first bank, I'm gonna walk over to the second bank. So basically, here's what happened. Okay, so with money, as most things go with governments and money, one of the reasons banks exist is to fund wars, right? So we gotta back up a little bit. In the colonial era, before the Revolutionary War, gold was the main type of money that the world accepted, right? And the colonists didn't have much gold. There wasn't much gold in the colonies. So how did they fund anything? Well, long story short, a guy named Benjamin Franklin had this clever idea that you could just print paper, and then that paper would be redeemable for gold bullion that was held in a centralized location. And that was seen at the time as sort of immoral. But Ben Franklin didn't care. He thought it was a great idea. So as a young 23-year-old, he started printing money in Pennsylvania, and that stabilized the Pennsylvania colony's economy. It also stabilized New Jersey. And basically, while the other colonies were defaulting and struggling to grow because they didn't have enough gold to pay their debts, the Pennsylvania economy boomed because people, it turns out, didn't really care if it was, if you could redeem the gold or not, or the paper or not for gold. So they just wanted the paper, and it worked, and the Pennsylvania colony grew. All right, there you go, folks. So that's how the bricks cut when they're redoing old buildings around here in Philadelphia. But basically, by the time the Revolutionary War rolled around, the Continental Congress needed some way to pay soldiers, and they didn't have much gold. So in comes Ben Franklin with his printing press, and he started printing more money to pay the soldiers. Here's the thing: a lot of people think of Benjamin Franklin as a journalist and a printer because he was printing newspapers, the Pennsylvania Gazette, which is true, but he also was printing money. He was printing the continental dollars. They were called continentals, I believe, and he was printing that money to pay the soldiers. So that was also one of his main roles. And why, when the Second Continental Congress met to organize the Revolutionary War, they made Ben Franklin the head printer, both to spread propaganda. Sorry, I have something in my hair. That's funny. Oh well. Both to spread propaganda and to print the money to pay the soldiers. Now, of course, by the time the war ended, the Continental Congress was broke, and they couldn't really pay back the soldiers. The money that Benjamin Franklin had printed was more or less worthless. You couldn't really redeem it for any gold. And So the soldiers who fought the Revolutionary War were really mad, essentially. After all, they had laid down their lives to defend their country and establish this country, and they couldn't get paid. So it became a problem, and debates raged throughout the constitutional era about whether to establish a government bank to pay soldiers, and the need for that became very apparent later on as the new country formed. This is Carpenter's Hall, where the First Continental Congress met. Now, by the time the war was over and the Constitution had been signed, a new problem had arisen, namely rogue banks that were at the state level and local level issuing their own paper scripts because they'd sort of heard what Ben Franklin was doing and liked the idea. So they started gathering gold in banks and then issuing paper monies, paper currencies backed by the gold that they had in their banks. This was happening across the colonies, which were now the US, across the young states. Each town had their own bank, and there were hundreds of them. And it was a big problem. The problem, of course, was how do you trust a smaller bank, right? If it's a local bank and they decide not to pay out when you want to redeem your paper for gold, what do? What authority can you use to force the bank to pay you? You have no recourse. This then is where Alexander Hamilton comes in. He was made Treasury Secretary by 1789, and in the 1790s argued for a central bank so that basically the U.S. government wouldn't have to, it's both for the people and the U.S. government, both people and government would not have to deal with these private banks, these small, unregulated, very shady private banks scattered across the land whenever they needed to fund things like the army and like civil defense and trade. There were a lot of merchants that were getting ripped off by shady banks, and the U.S. government itself needed to buy things to fund national defense, to build buildings, to run commerce, all the things that make a young nation successful. And Hamilton sort of saw these smaller regional banks as predatory lenders that were basically taking the nation for a ride. So what does Hamilton propose? Of course, a centralized bank where the nation could pool all its gold and issue centralized currency to combat this growing grifter economy that was springing up. Of course, Jefferson opposed this. We won't go into the full debate, but essentially Jefferson famously did not want to give the central government more power. He saw this as a corrupting force. He thought for sure that the central government of the US would start becoming corrupt, and that it would favor special interest groups, which of course we know absolutely has happened. So he was right about that, and special interest groups he feared would corrupt the central government and warp it so that it no longer served the will of the people. Now, here's what ended up happening. So Jefferson argued that a central bank was unconstitutional. Hamilton made the opposite claim. He said Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution it's called the Necessary and Proper Clause, and it gave the U.S. government the power to do whatever was necessary and proper. And this was very controversial because many argued that if this clause was used to create a central bank that wasn't explicitly mandated by the Constitution, that this would essentially expand the powers of the U.S. Constitution and give the central government carte blanche to do whatever it wanted in the future based on this necessary and proper clause. Hamilton argued that in order for the defense of the nation, he argued that European powers all had central banks. He argued that basically a central bank was a necessary and proper addition to civic society so that the U.S. could grow. And this convinced Washington, and 2 days after Hamilton proposed it, Washington signed the bill and passed the congressional bill to establish the first central bank of the United States. And that's what that building was. So then the question is, why did it fail? Well, the first bank of the U.S. was only chartered for 20 years. And in that 20 years, the U.S. boomed. From the 1790s to the 1810s, the U.S. became a major global power. Commerce, at least the Industrial Revolution kicked off in a big way. Cotton became a staple. The slave economy grew substantially, and clearly the central bank was a good idea. I think it really helped establish industry in young America. So, why did it fail? How you doing? Good morning. Well, basically, the answer is that all those tiny little banks, those regional banks and state level banks, they wanted to make money. And the big central bank of the US the first US bank was so successful at gathering gold, hoarding gold, and setting up a protected fund that then protected the people from predatory lending. It was so successful at crushing the profit margins of smaller banks and making sure that things ran well that the smaller banks were mad. They couldn't make as much money as before the central bank was created. And this led to a big debate. There is much more nuance than what I'm covering here. But essentially, in 1811, there was a vote to whether to renew the charter for the first bank. And all these smaller banks got together, funded some politicians, and made sure that the first bank of the US failed. Now, it failed by one vote. They didn't renew the charter by one vote. That just shows you how close this was and how much corruption was already apparent. Let's say hi to SEPTA. So in 1811, the smaller banks made sure that the central bank was not renewed. The charter was not renewed. And then what do we know happened in 1812? The War of 1812. And boy, oh boy, was that a mistake. It was a huge disaster to not renew the charter of the first bank on the eve of a new war, because suddenly the US government could not fund the war effort. And the US government got trounced. The states got, New York City Harbor, which was by that point a major hub of import from Britain, got, basically imports stopped. What's barricaded? Not barricaded, when there's a naval barricade. What's that called? An embargo? Anyway, basically the British stopped importing things stopped imports coming in from New York, so all the New York banks couldn't give their money to there's no way for the central bank, there was no income tax at that time, so there's no way for the central bank of the US to fund the war effort, and the British successfully invaded and, as we all know, burned the White House down. Also, immediately after the War of 1812, the number of small predatory banks exploded, and by 1815 there were many hundreds of smaller state-level banks, and they needed the president and the US government kind of realized they actually needed a central bank, so they started the second bank of the United States. Today, this building is more or less just a portrait gallery. You can go inside and see some amazing paintings of the founding fathers. Back then they didn't have photography, right? So you can see some of the original paintings, portraits of the founding fathers and what they would have looked like. But at the time when this building was built and the second bank was started, this set up one of the most important showdowns in financial history, in American history, and it sort of this building played a direct role in why New York City became the center of banking instead of the center of banking in America remaining in Philadelphia. Now, we won't go into the whole story here because that's a much longer tale for another time, but essentially, the main enemy of this bank was Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson hated this bank for political reasons, and he basically wanted to defund it. And this led to a huge political battle in which, as I mentioned earlier, most of the imports were coming in through New York, not Philadelphia. And Andrew Jackson had ties to New York. He wanted to make sure that his funders from New York banks gained power. And so he slowly started, he went through 3 treasury secretaries, and the third guy he found decided to work with him to defund this bank slowly over time, and essentially slowly suffocate the second bank of the US in favor of the small banks. Oh, that's the bell from Independence Hall. What a beautiful sound to hear in the morning while talking about Philadelphia history. That was the bell in Independence Hall ringing. So, long story short, Andrew Jackson successfully defunded this bank in his second term and moved the center of US banking to Wall Street in New York City. And that's why Wall Street in New York is now the center of finance for the whole world. Now, there's a whole separate story here about or a related story, it's part of the story, which is Western land speculation out west as Andrew Jackson and the rest of America colonized and stole land from the Native Americans in the western states. They sold the land back to East Coasters and did so using those small private banks. So the small banks out west would fund the sale of stolen land using paper currency that was basically fraudulent, and Andrew Jackson promoted all of this by killing off this second central bank. So we'll end this story by explaining that when Andrew Jackson finally killed off this bank, it removed the last regulatory hurdle to preventing the smaller banks from selling land speculatively out west. This caused a huge problem out west because there was suddenly the bank in England, which was funding a lot of the speculation in the west, realized that the currencies issued by these banks out west were not backed by anything. The market collapsed because the British raised the interest rates on these American dollars, and so essentially the loans collapsed out west, leading to land speculation collapse, and this killed the U.S. economy for a little while, and this led to what was called the crash of 1837. So the 1837 crash was in part, or almost directly, I guess you could say, caused by Andrew Jackson's hate for this second bank. Well, finally, it must be said also that the guy who ran this second bank was not very good at his job. He essentially accelerated the crash of 1837 because he thought that doing so would make Jackson unpopular. That backfired spectacularly because actually what happened is it made central banking unpopular. And so when Andrew Jackson finally got this bank, put it into the grave, that meant that that was a very popular move. And for the people of America didn't like this central bank because they blamed it for the crash of 1837, even though that's not, it's like maybe not fully true, right? Probably less true, actually. But in any case, central banks were very unpopular by that point, and so for 77 years, or at least 70 years after this bank went under, the U.S. Did not have a central bank. There were no central banks in the US anymore for 70 years after this. Okay, we made it. So with all that stressful money talk out of the way, I wanted to just say thank you for coming along on this walk this morning. My name is Sean. If you appreciated this history and other, and this kind of historic walk and talk through Pennsylvania and Philadelphia history, give me a subscribe if you don't mind, and leave a like for the algorithm. Also, I'm doing membership videos, so feel free to become a member. And I'll be starting an email list soon. So if you want to join the email list where I send out little facts and other sort of updates about the channel or things I couldn't include in these videos, email's in the description. Here, there will be videos that you might find interesting that I've also made. So yeah, thanks for stopping by. My name's Sean. This is my channel, It's All Good. See you in the next one. Bye.